Let's begin by reading the first 6 verses of chapter 8 once again. Now, the point in what we are saying is this: we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the sanctuary and the true tent, which is set up not by man, but by the Lord. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Hence, it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and a shadow of the heavenly sanctuary. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern which is showing you on the mountain." But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry which is as much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. So when we left off last week, we were discussing, actually it wasn't last week, when we left off 2 weeks ago. Last week we digressed a bit to discuss liturgy and sacrifice. So 2 weeks ago we were discussing the elements, what's needed for a good sacrifice. So I think we had fairly extensively covered the priest. We had, I think, extensively covered the thing to be sacrificed. What we sort of glossed over was the place of sacrifice. On the one hand, we have the temple, or in the author's case, he's talking about the tabernacle. And we have the heavenly throne room. For the temple, there's a certain tension involved. Does anyone see what the tension is?
Well, first of all, it's a copy.
Yeah, it's a copy. So in that case, what is the tension?
Not the true place. It's not the true heavenly throne. So that would create a tension. Also, only the high priest can go in certain parts of it, not for everyone.
Right. The tension is that God is thought to be present. The temple is presumably the abode of God, but God doesn't dwell in man-made buildings. And the building is necessarily, if God did dwell in man-made buildings, the building is necessarily greater than the being that it contains. So let's take a look at 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 27 through 30. So this is Solomon's dedication of the temple, which replaces the tabernacle. But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house which I have built? Yet have regard to the prayer of your servant and to his supplication, O Lord my God, listening to the cry and to the prayer which your servant prays before you this day, that your eyes may be open night and day toward this house, the place of which you have said, my name shall be there, that you may listen to the prayer which your servant offers toward this place. And hear the supplication of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray toward this place. Yes, here in heaven, your dwelling place. And when you hear, forgive. Here in heaven, your dwelling place. So a recognition that although God is thought to be present in his temple, God is not present in his temple. So the author of Hebrews expresses that as Moses built it according to the specification that God gave him, so it becomes a copy. What would be striking about that to the author's audience, to a Jew of his time?
Well, they thought that God was in the Ark of the Covenant.
Right. And the temple is
But with them.
the center of worship. So it's inconceivable, really, that there be another.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, a great deal of as Judaism developed, a great deal of effort was devoted to sort of removing and eliminating alternate or competing temples of sacrifice. They were generally described as high places and places of pagan sacrifice, but in fact, some were alternate places of sacrifice of the people of Israel to Yahweh, not but they were simply, in some sense, competing centers to the temple in Jerusalem. So,
Yeah, you can't be in both places.
right. So then calling it a copy means what?
It would imply there's more than one, and the copy is usually less than.
Yeah, copy is less than. And that's a huge put down. So then, as opposed to that, Jesus presents his sacrifice in the heavenly temple, in the heavenly sanctuary, before the throne of God. So that's significant. I think we've covered the priest who offers the sacrifice. We've covered the place of sacrifice. Someone to sacrifice to is Yahweh. Something to sacrifice we've covered.
Yeah.
Someone on behalf of whom the sacrifice is offered. So what about that?
It would be the priest or the sinners, the priest doing it on behalf of the sinners.
On the Day of Atonement, the priest does it on behalf of himself.
Right, but on other days.
And then on behalf of others. Otherwise, on behalf of others most commonly. So we have animals that are offered on behalf of someone, on behalf of the high priest, a ram or a bull, on behalf of the people, a lamb or a goat. So do we need to offer anything? So Jesus offers himself as the perfect sacrifice, right? That sacrifice is presented directly to the Father before the heavenly throne room. So how do we get involved in that?
Our sacrifice joins his.
And how do we indicate that?
Well, one of them is in one of the prayers that we're lifting up our sacrifice,
Mm-hmm.
and that we're thinking about the fact that we're doing that.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then what completes the sacrifice?
When we try to do the closest we can to being Jesus inside us, helping us to live a better life, serving others.
There's also another way, or there's also the sacrifice. So in a lot of ways, so remember, the author is drawing on the Day of Atonement, and he's also drawing on Moses and Jesus being greater than Moses. So, and the whole thing with entering his rest. So the Passover is also present in sort of the back of his mind, not terribly explicitly. I mean, so for God's people, the sort of great crowning event was the Exodus. Right? So how is the covenant seal in the Exodus?
With the blood of the lambs on the doorposts.
Is that it?
Well, and the blood of Christ.
And then what happens after the blood of the lamb?
Are you talking about in Revelations?
No, I'm talking about Exodus,
Oh, Exodus.
the Passover.
Okay.
So the Passover is one of the really defining events.
Right. So there's the blood of the lamb, and then the unleavened bread that's taken with them.
And what else?
They have to cook and eat the lamb.
Exactly. They have to cook and eat the lamb. The whole ritual is not completed until the lamb is eaten. And that's really important. So Exodus chapter 12, let's begin with verse 1. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. So notice it becomes the first month of the year because it's a new beginning. Similarly, for us, Sunday becomes the first day of the week because it is a new beginning. It supersedes Sabbath, the Sabbath, which is the day on which God finished his creation after 7 days. And what we're celebrating is the beginning of a new creation on the first day. So the history of the early church celebrating the Sabbath was considered a form of heresy. It wasn't considered a form of heresy, considered a heresy. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, they shall take every man a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then a man and his neighbor next to his house shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each can eat. You shall make your count for the lamb. So everybody has to take a lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old. You shall take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of the month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs in the evening. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses in which they eat them. Notice emphasis already on eating them. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted. With unleavened bread and bitter herbs, they shall eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled with water, but roasted, its head with its legs and its inner parts. And you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it, your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. And then in verse 14 it says, this day shall be for you a memorial day, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord. Throughout your generations you shall observe it as an ordinance forever. And so lamb is the consumed each year on the Passover. So the final act of really sealing the covenant and marking yourself as a member of the people of God is by eating the sacrifice. So what does that have to do with us?
What does that have to do with us?
Uh-huh.
Then we eat the sacrifice, which is the Eucharist.
Exactly. We eat the sacrifice to renew our covenant with God and to join in the sacrifice and to make ourselves participants of the sacrifice. We've discussed the elements of sacrifice. Last week, we discussed his use of the word liturgios, ministry, as being liturgical ministry, not ministry in a generic sense that we've come to associate with the word ministry. So the hospitality ministry and the I have a teaching ministry, whatever. Those are all not ministries in the sense of what the author of Hebrews would use, that they're not ministries in the sense of liturgies. But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry which is as much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. So first of all, what is a promise?
What is the promise?
What is a promise? Yeah.
It's an oath.
The oath is evidence for the promise.
Oh, okay.
So there are three questions here. One is, what is a promise? And what is the evidence for the promise? And why are these promises better? So what is a promise? What are the promises that the author is talking about here?
The promise is that you are a priest forever, and the establishment of a new covenant written on their hearts.
So the promise has, remember the previous promise, which he spent a lot of time on, entering rest. The promise has a present dimension and it has a future dimension. One can enter into God's rest now. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. Today you can enter God's rest. And it has a future dimension. Similarly, here, there is a present dimension and there is a future dimension.
The future dimension is the promise of life after death, eternal life.
Right. Yeah, so the future dimension is our presence before the heavenly throne directly. He says where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf. And then the new heaven and the new earth.
So the covenant written in the heart would be considered present also, wouldn't it?
Right, and that's really very important. I mean, it's in some sense meaningless to say that, after we die, God's laws are written in our hearts because we're dead.
Mm.
And also, if we're in heaven, presumably, the separation between us and God has dissolved. So in some sense, it makes no difference. There's no need for a covenant in heaven. That's the promise. A covenant that exists in the present, something that exists in the present that will be fully completed only in the future. And so that looks back to the chapter 4 and rest. So it's significant here how the author is implicitly drawing on previous parts of the letter to the Hebrews. It sort of tied together his argument. So what is the evidence for the promise, the promises? From Jeremiah, the fact that God has promised a new covenant. We haven't actually gotten to verse 8 yet, but this is the longest quotation in Hebrews. So there's a promise that will be a new covenant. There's an oath, and the oath indicates unchangeability, certainty. God cannot reverse something. God's oath indicates that something is not provisional, that it cannot be reversed, that its appearance is certain, and that God will bring it about. So why are these promises better? What makes them better?
They're put both in our minds and our hearts rather than imposed from outside.
Mm-hmm. That's one thing, and that's really significant. The law, the promises, the law, the covenant is not imposed from outside. They should not be external to us. They should be internal to us. What also follows from that, if the covenant has to be internal to us, then force, coercion, or compulsion should never be used to spread the faith or to bring the faith to people's attention. Vatican II points that out, makes that point very strongly, and reverses a good deal of Catholic practice from the Middle Ages up to Vatican II. So that's really important in our own day, where we see the demand for 10 commandments on courthouse steps. We see the demand to bring back compulsory prayer in school. We see the lie that prayer has been taken out of schools, when in fact it hasn't. We see the notion that this is a Christian nation based on a complete falsification of history. So the law has to be written in our hearts. God's law has to be written in our hearts. Why else are the promises better? They're not imposed from outside, they're internal to us, which relates to us individually and as a people of God. But in some sense, independently of us, within the context of a sacrificial system, what makes the promises better?
God sacrificed his son as part of it to forgive us for our sins.
Right. So there's a better sacrifice. The unblemished lamb, on the one hand, is sinless because it's a lamb, but it's not a willing participant. It's a very unfortunate victim that just happens to be dragged into the middle of our sacrifice. If it knew what was going to happen, it would almost certainly, well, it wouldn't almost certainly. If it knew what was going to happen, it would certainly object. Self-preservation being an important principle of every living being. We have a lamb that is unwittingly sacrificed, which is, in some sense, not a very good sacrifice, but it's the best thing available, since humans can't. Human sacrifice is impermissible. And then we have sacrifice of Christ, of Jesus, both man and God. So a better sacrifice. What else makes the promises better? So we have it's not imposed from the outside. We have it's a better sacrifice.
It includes an oath, so it's unchangeable.
What about the priest offering the sacrifice?
Well, in Jesus' case, he was the priest too. And a heavenly priest that lasts forever.
So the mediator is better, the priest is better, the person offering the sacrifice. However much the high priest might, and the Levitical priests might try to separate themselves, they remain members of sinful humanity, and they remain sinful, which is they aren't transformed by their ordination. And so hence on the Day of Atonement, they have to offer a bull, which is a really striking fact, considering a bull for themselves, a lamb or goat for the sins of the people. Really striking fact considering that they're supposed to be holy. But the high priest offers the bull first.
The more you know, the more you have to offer.
Yeah. As opposed to Jesus as priest, as God in human form, he recognized the difficulty that humans have in struggling with sinfulness. Similarly, as man, he recognized, and remaining sinless, he recognized the difficulty that his fellow human beings have in remaining sinless. And also recognize the difficulty in fulfilling or obeying God's will, achieving God's will, obeying God. So a complete ability to identify with sinful humanity. So a superior mediator. And then what's the final thing that makes the promises better? We have not imposed from the outside. We have God's oath, therefore something that God will bring about certainly. We have a better sacrifice. We have better mediation by a better mediator. What's the final thing?
It's forever.
It's forever, right? That's another thing. It's not provisional. So at least one more than the promises are better because they also occur or happen in the context of a better temple. And so the temple in Jerusalem is not really the abode of God. Temple sacrifices don't really happen before the throne room of God. There's that tension between God's presence and God's heavenly throne room, between God dwelling in a building and God filling the universe.
So you're saying they happen in the context of the heavenly throne instead of the temple.
Right,
Okay.
right.
There's a lot more to it than I ever understood.
I think that covers the first 6 verses of the chapter, unless one other thing. Oh, actually, a couple of things. Seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven. What does that mean? Does anyone see the significance of being seated?
A guest of honor is seated at the right hand.
Mm-hmm. So earlier, that's based on the author's use of Psalm 110. If you remember it, actually way back in chapter 1, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else?
I was going to ask if being seated at the right hand of the majesty, that's different than standing in front of him. Being seated is permanent. You're a part of the action. You're the primary, one of the primary actors. It seems to me that whenever we see pictures of courts, the subjects stand in front of the royalty or the throne,
Right.
but to be seated on the throne, that is permanent. You're going to be here a while.
Right.
That's about it. That's all I can say. That it's not transient. That Jesus is not transient. He is a permanent part of the. I hate to say decision making, but I don't know how else to say it.
Well, that's one way to say it. Yeah. Decision making. The sitting is very significant because it's permanent, it means a completed work. And it also means priests don't sit when they minister. There's no sitting. There's only standing. It means, first of all, that this high priest is much greater than any other high priest. It means that his work is completed. And it means that he is occupying a position of equality with God, a place of honor, and because it's seated, a place of equality. So the sitting is really very, very significant. There's one other thing. Hence, it is necessary for this priest to have something to offer. And he also says he continues a priest forever. And a priest is someone who presents sacrifices and offerings. But on the other hand, his sacrifice was a one-time sacrifice. So how do we reconcile that? How do we explain that? One-time offering continues a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek.
It was an infinite sacrifice, better than any other sacrifice ever.
Any other way?
And he sacrificed himself, not something else.
Could it be that if he has, this is necessary for this one also to have something to offer? He already offered it in his life, but is it possible that such a great thing, such a great event can never be forgotten? So it is, I can only compare things with a little bit of life that I know, and we worship our war heroes. We build monuments to them and everything else. And they are, you might not know what they did, but you know that they did something. And so it is with this priest. What he did, what he has to offer is what he has already offered, and it is a lifetime gift. It doesn't even have to be mentioned. It is so prominent. God, I wish I had commanded the English language.
But what is that memory called? Does anyone remember?
Would you repeat that, please?
The memorial. What is the memorial? What is this? What does the memorial mean?
A remembrance.
What is remembrance?
Yeah. We're not really reliving it, but by telling the story, we are. You know, if some general did a great thing or somebody did something great, you tell the story during this memorial.
We're representing it.
Yes, yes, thank you.
Right, right. So the significant thing about the representation is that the same sacrifice is made real
Yes. Yeah.
through
yeah.
the remembrance. And so there's a single sacrifice, but that sacrifice is made real and present for us.
Mhm.
So remember, the Greek word is anamnesis. And then there's a corresponding Hebrew word, an Aramaic word, that forms the basis of the concept of anamnesis. So it's basically a past event that is brought into the present and is made real. So it's not our recalling the event that makes it real. It's the event that is made real and brought into the present. So it's not a subjective state. I think you could say it's a supernatural objective state.
Mhm.
So the Eucharist is an anamnesis. Do this in remembrance of me. It's not, that we're fondly looking back and kind of thinking, gee, Jesus is a nice guy to die for us. It's that the anamnesis goes back and makes the past event real, brings it into the present, or brings a past event into the present and makes it real for us, so that we can become participants, and then also projects it into the future.
Mhm.
So there's a present dimension and a future dimension, and the anamnesis is eschatological. So hence he continues as a priest forever through the anamnesis, because a priest always has to have something to offer. So that is, addresses the tension between a one-time sacrifice and continuing a priest forever. If it was simply a one-time sacrifice, then there would be no need to continue a priest forever. Anamnesis is really, really very, 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 very important. It's the basis of, the Eucharist. It's not that we're, kindly, sort of fondly remembering, thinking about Jesus and, looking back at an event that, we have no idea what it was, sort of about. And, expressing gratitude, which isn't to say we shouldn't be grateful, because we should, but it's also to say that it's so much more than that, and that we're participants and participating in the sacrifice. And we renew the covenant by eating the sacrifice, by consuming the sacrifice. And that's exactly what the Eucharist is. So
So that puts us to the next section the next time.
yeah,
Okay.
so we'll continue with the rest of the chapter next week,
Ooh,
and especially the long quotation from Jeremiah. So remember the long quotation from Jeremiah. Always, it's really foundational. The new covenant, which is written in our hearts. We, as disciples of Christ, as Catholics, we should always be aware that the new covenant is written in our hearts. Sometimes, we forget, but it's always lurking in there somewhere. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Lurking in there somewhere.